Kansas prairie felt mean that September morning, dust swirling, wind biting, and Daniel Kennedy standing at the Topeka auction yard like a man whose luck had officially run out. He was 28, 6 years into running a farm he'd never been trained for, and the Great Depression was squeezing every last drop of hope out of the Midwest. A losing Ranger, the only horse he'd ever handled without fear, had been the final punch he didn't know how to recover from. He'd come with $53, not enough to make a smart choice, just enough to make a desperate one. Cyrus Brenner, the auctioneer with a soft spot for struggling farmers, clapped him on the shoulder. "Sorry about Ranger. Looking for something gentle, I assume?" Daniel nodded. He didn't need strength. He needed a horse that wouldn't punish him for fumbling a buckle. Most of the afternoon was a parade of horses he couldn't afford or couldn't handle. By the time Lot 52 entered the ring, Daniel was already bracing for disappointment. And then he saw her. A cream-colored draft mare, medium build, champagne coat, flaxen mane, and the calmest eyes he'd seen on any animal that day. No tension, no nerves, just quiet awareness. "Pearl," Cyrus announced. "American cream draft. Rare breed, gentle. Perfect for novice handlers." Those last words hit Daniel right in the chest. The bidding started at $40. Nobody moved. Nobody trusted an unfamiliar breed in times this hard. 40 going once. Daniel's pulse hammered. He knew this was insane, knew he should walk away. Instead, he raised his hand. 45! The gavel dropped like fate sealing itself. Pearl was his. He didn't know it yet, but that single impulsive bid was the moment that would change everything. For him, for the farm, and eventually for an entire disappearing breed. The drive back to the Kennedy farm felt longer than usual, dust blowing across the road as Daniel kept glancing in the rearview mirror at the borrowed trailer. Pearl stood steady inside, as calm as if she'd made this trip 100 times. He wished he felt half as steady. The farm looked tired when he pulled in. Peeling paint, sagging fences, fields that hadn't forgiven his inexperience. His mother, Ruth, stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron the way she did when she was bracing for bad news. "Well?" she asked. Daniel lowered the ramp, and Pearl stepped out, smooth, confident, unbothered. Ruth's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "She's beautiful," she said softly. "And she looks gentle." Daniel shrugged, trying not to show how terrified he was of failing again. "Auctioneer said she's good with beginners." Pearl walked the corral like she was evaluating the property, not the other way around. Head low, ears forward, absorbing everything with quiet intelligence. Ruth leaned close to Daniel. "She moves like she knows what she's doing. Maybe she'll teach you a thing or two." He laughed nervously. "God knows I need it." But as evening settled over the farm, he watched Pearl graze, calm, steady, unflappable. And for the first time in months, hope didn't feel like a foolish thing. Maybe this wasn't a mistake. Maybe this horse was the beginning of something he couldn't yet imagine. Daniel barely slept. By sunrise, he was already in the barn, heart thudding as he gathered the harness. Working with Ranger had always been tense, a quiet battle between his clumsy hands and a patient horse who tolerated more mistakes than most animals ever would. Pearl, however, didn't wait for him to fumble his way into trouble. The moment she saw the harness, she shifted her body into position, as if inviting him to begin. When he lifted the bridle, she dipped her head to make the job easier. When he paused to untangle a strap, she simply waited, still as carved stone, giving him all the time he needed. "Are you helping me?" he muttered. Pearl flicked an ear. If she could have answered, Daniel suspected it would have been a yes. Hitching her to the little cart felt like stepping into someone else's life. Someone competent. She backed neatly at his voice command, stopped the moment he hesitated, and held her position as though she'd been trained by a master instead of handed to a shaky farmhand. By the time they rolled out into the pasture, Daniel's nerves had settled into something dangerous. Confidence. Pearl pulled the loaded cart with smooth, sure power, her gait steady as heartbeat. When he forgot to cue her before a turn, she adjusted on her own. When he gave a crooked signal, she offered a gentle correction instead of reacting. Not stubborn, not fearful, just understanding. By the time they made it back to the barn, Daniel was smiling so hard his cheeks hurt. His mother met them at the gate. "Well?" Daniel patted Pearl's neck, feeling the warmth of her muscles and the calm in her breathing. "She didn't just work," he said. "She taught me." Ruth's eyes softened. "Then, son, I think you finally found the right horse." And deep down, Daniel knew she was right. Within a week, Daniel knew Pearl wasn't just a good horse. She was the best partner he'd ever had on the farm. And somehow, she always seemed one step ahead of him. Need to maneuver the cart between tight fence posts? Pearl adjusted her stride before he even finished the cue. Unclear signal on a turn? She paused, waiting for him to get it right instead of plowing forward. Forgotten verbal command? Pearl read the terrain and slowed or stopped on her own. It was like working with a seasoned farmhand who simply didn't speak English. Daniel had never experienced anything like it. He'd go to bed exhausted but not defeated, a new feeling for him. And every morning, Pearl would be waiting at the gate, ears forward, as if eager to start the day. Word spread fast in small farm towns. By the second week, neighbors were already noticing the changes. Fence lines were straight again. Pastures were cleared of old fallen branches. A field that had been half plowed for months was finally turned over and ready for planting. "Daniel's getting the hang of things," folks said. But the truth was simpler. Pearl made him better. One afternoon, his closest neighbor, William Crawford, leaned on the fence and watched Pearl pull a heavy log like it weighed nothing. "That new mare of yours, she's something," Crawford called. Daniel couldn't hide his pride. "She's the reason anything's getting done around here." Crawford chuckled. "Son, she's doing the work of 2 good horses and half a hired man." That comment would soon reach someone important, someone whose curiosity would change the Kennedy farm forever. But for now, Daniel just rested a hand on Pearl's shoulder, grateful for the strange twist of luck that had brought her into his life. He wasn't just keeping the farm afloat anymore. He was finally learning how to be the farmer he'd always hoped he could become. It didn't take long for Pearl to become the talk of the county. Farmers who'd once shaken their heads at Daniel's struggles were now slowing their wagons as they passed the Kennedy place, trying to catch a glimpse of the cream-colored mare who worked like 3 horses in one. Daniel felt the shift too. Jobs that used to take him all day now took an hour. Tasks he'd avoided were suddenly manageable. And for the first time since taking over the farm, he didn't dread the mornings. One chilly afternoon, while Pearl dragged a harrow across a field with smooth, perfect rhythm, Daniel noticed a horseman watching from the road, tall in the saddle, arms crossed, studying every move. It was Arthur Cooper, the most experienced farmer in the county, the man whose operation dwarfed everyone else's. He didn't waste time with greetings. "That horse of yours," Cooper called, "she works like she's reading your mind." Daniel swallowed. "She's been a blessing." Cooper nodded slowly, thoughtfully, the way a man does when he sees an opportunity forming. "Mind if I come by tomorrow?" he asked. "I want to see how she handles other hands." Daniel hesitated, then nodded. He didn't know it yet, but this visit would set the next part of his life in motion, a part that would take Pearl's story far beyond the Kennedy farm. Cooper showed up early the next morning with 2 of his hired hands, both solid workers, neither of them expert horsemen. Daniel's stomach twisted as he saddled Pearl, suddenly terrified she'd make him look foolish. But Pearl? Pearl stood calm as morning sunlight, ears flicked forward, ready. Daniel demonstrated the basics, how she backed to the cart, how she responded to simple voice cues. Then he stepped aside and let Cooper's men try. That was the moment everything changed. Pearl worked for them exactly as she worked for Daniel. Patient, steady, almost guiding them. If their commands were sloppy, she waited. When they hesitated, she made the smallest possible adjustment to help them along. Not once did she balk, rush, or resist. By the end of an hour, the two men, grown, seasoned farmhands, were practically grinning. Cooper was impressed, and he didn't hide it. "That's not normal," he muttered, circling Pearl like a man inspecting a machine he couldn't figure out. "Most horses make novices worse. She makes them better." Daniel had known Pearl was special, but hearing someone like Cooper say it out loud made it feel real. And then Cooper asked the question Daniel wasn't ready for. "Where can I get one of these?" Daniel blinked. "I don't know. She came from the Hartwell farm in Nebraska." Cooper nodded slowly, the gears turning behind his eyes. "Well, Kennedy," he said, "you may be sitting on something bigger than you realize." Daniel stood beside Pearl, resting a hand against her warm shoulder, heart pounding. For the first time, he wondered if buying her hadn't been luck at all, but the start of something much larger. Cooper wasn't a man who let curiosity sit. Within days, he had letters sent, calls made, and names tracked down across 3 states. And one afternoon, he rode back to the Kennedy farm with news that knocked the breath out of Daniel's lungs. "Daniel," he said, swinging off his horse, "you're not just lucky. You're holding one of the rarest draft horses in America." Daniel frowned. "Rare? How?" Cooper folded his arms, eyes sharp. "The Hartwells told me there are fewer than 200 American cream draft horses left. Maybe fewer. Only a handful are working animals. The rest are breeding stock." Daniel stared at Pearl grazing in the pasture, the sunlight glowing off her champagne coat. "You're telling me she's one of 50 working creams in the entire country?" "Maybe one of 20, Cooper corrected. "And according to the Hartwells, she's one of the best they've ever produced." Daniel felt the earth tip under him. He'd thought he bought a good farm horse, not a piece of living agricultural history. But Cooper wasn't done. "There's demand for horses like her," he said. "Farmers are desperate. Machinery is too expensive. Labor is short. Horses like Pearl?" He tapped his chest. "They're the future of small farms. There's enough of them to go around." Daniel followed Cooper's gaze back to Pearl. She lifted her head, as if sensing their attention, and let out a soft nicker that floated across the field. And right then, the idea struck, sudden, terrifying, thrilling. He could help bring the breed back. He could breed Pearl, not for profit, but for preservation. For farmers like him. For the future. And maybe finally for a purpose that felt like his own. The more Daniel thought about breeding Pearl, the more impossible it seemed. Then, the Hartwells wrote back. They told him about Eclipse, a proven American cream stallion in Iowa, one of the few left with clean bloodlines. And he was for sale. For $300. Daniel felt sick when he read the number. $300 was more money than he'd ever held at once, more than the farm had seen in months, more than they could afford to gamble. That night, he sat at the kitchen table with the letter in his hands while his mother kneaded dough across from him. $300, he said quietly. "If it goes wrong, we lose everything." Ruth wiped her hands on her apron and studied him for a long moment. "Your father always said," she murmured, "the biggest failure in farming is being too afraid to try." Daniel swallowed. "But what if I'm wrong?" "Then we start over," Ruth said. "But if you're right, you save a breed that's dying." It wasn't a push, it was permission. The kind he didn't know he needed. The next morning, Daniel sent the money. And by the end of the week, Eclipse arrived, calm, strong, and every bit as intelligent as Pearl. Daniel stared at the 2 rare horses in his pasture and whispered the truth out loud for the first time. This is bigger than farming. It was the beginning of something far greater than he expected. Spring came early that year, softening the Kansas soil and filling the air with the smell of new grass. But nothing filled Daniel with more anticipation or fear than the moment Pearl began showing signs that her first foal was on the way. He'd read every book he could find, talked to every breeder who would answer his letters, and paced so many circles in the barn that Pearl looked genuinely amused. Then, one cool April morning, it happened. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Daniel heard Pearl nicker, low, insistent, different. He rushed into the barn just in time to see her lowering herself into the straw. An hour later, a small, cream-colored filly stood on shaky legs beside Pearl, blinking at the world with bright amber eyes. Daniel felt something inside him unlock. Wonder, relief, and a hope he hadn't dared give words to. By midsummer, Pearl and Eclipse had produced 3 foals, each one displaying the same traits that made their parents extraordinary. Calm, intuitive, eager to learn. Word spread fast. Farmers drove miles just to see the young creams trotting around the Kennedy pasture, their champagne coats shining in the sun. "You've got something special here, son," said Dr. Westbrook, the local vet, during one visit. "If these youngsters grow the way your mare has, you're not just breeding horses. You're rebuilding a future." Daniel didn't say anything, but as he leaned on the fence and watched the foals chase each other through the grass, he felt the truth settle in his chest. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just trying to survive. He was building something that mattered. It didn't take long before news of the Kennedy foals traveled far beyond the county line. At first it was curious neighbors, then farmers from the next towns over, then letters, so many letters, that Ruth had to clear a drawer just to keep them organized. People wanted American creams, not one, not someday, now. Farmers struggling through the Depression were discovering what Daniel already knew. A strong, intelligent draft horse that worked well with inexperienced hands could save an entire operation. By the end of summer, Daniel had more requests than horses. Men arrived in muddy trucks and dusty wagons just for a chance to watch the foals move. Light-footed, calm, sharp-eyed, everything a working horse needed to be. One afternoon, Arthur Cooper rode over again, tipping his hat with a rare smile. "You realize you're filling the biggest gap in the Midwest right now, don't you?" he said. "Not everyone can afford tractors. Not everyone has trained horsemen left on their farms. Your creams, they're the answer." Daniel tried to brush it off, but Cooper wasn't done. "You're not running a hobby," he said. "You're running a lifeline." That evening, Daniel stood in the pasture, watching Pearl graze beside her foals. Eclipse stood a few yards away, proud and steady, the sun catching his pale mane. He'd come to the auction with nothing but desperation and $53. Now, farmers from 3 states were asking for horses with the Kennedy brand, all because Pearl had chosen him. Or maybe because he'd chosen her when no one else would. Either way, the future didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like a calling. Success has a way of attracting attention, and not just from neighbors. By the next year, the quiet buzz around Daniel's horses turned into something bigger. Agricultural magazines started printing little blurbs about the cream-colored draft revival in Kansas. A traveling seed salesman snapped a photo of Pearl and her foals and sent it to a regional farm bulletin. And then, one crisp autumn morning, a government truck rolled up the Kennedy dirt lane. A man stepped out wearing a neatly pressed suit and the unmistakable posture of someone who didn't do manual labor. "Dr. Robert Hayes," he introduced himself, "Agricultural Extension Service." Daniel wiped his hands on his jeans, suddenly aware he was still smelling of hay and leather. "What can I do for you, sir?" "I've heard," Hayes said, removing his hat as he looked across the pasture, "that you're breeding the only Native American draft horse still standing." He walked the field with Daniel, watching Pearl pull a plow with that smooth, intuitive rhythm she was famous for. Then, he watched a young farmhand, barely 16, Work with one of the yearlings who responded as gently as if he'd trained horses his whole life. Hayes nodded, impressed. "This," he said, "is exactly what America needs right now. A horse with strength, brains, and a temperament that forgives mistakes." He spent the whole afternoon evaluating the horses, asking question after question, scribbling notes. When he finally closed his notebook, he gave Daniel a look that felt like the beginning of something monumental. "I'm recommending your American cream drafts for federal demonstration programs," Hayes said. "Small farms, low mechanization operations, training programs. These horses," he gestured toward Pearl, "should be the backbone of it." Daniel just stood there, stunned. Government backing, regional demonstrations, a national spotlight on his tiny farm, all because of one mare nobody else wanted. That evening, Ruth found him outside long after sunset, sitting on the pasture fence, staring at Pearl as if seeing her for the first time all over again. "You all right?" she asked. Daniel nodded slowly. "Ma, I think this is bigger than us now." Ruth smiled. "Then be ready. Big things don't wait." And as Pearl lifted her head in the moonlight, amber eyes glowing softly, Daniel felt it too. This wasn't just a breeding program anymore. It was a legacy taking shape right in front of him. The government endorsement changed everything almost overnight. What had once been a quiet Kansas farm suddenly became a destination. Extension agents, breeders, reporters, even curious townsfolk all showed up wanting to see the horses that were being called the future of small-scale farming. Daniel did his best not to be overwhelmed. Pearl, on the other hand, seemed to take the attention as calmly as she took everything else. Visitors watched her work and shook their heads in disbelief. "She moves like she's thinking," one man muttered. "She is thinking," another replied. The real breakthrough came at the state agricultural fair. Daniel brought Pearl and 2 young cream yearlings for a public demonstration. At first, the crowd seemed unsure. Many had never seen the breed before. But the moment Pearl backed herself neatly into position at Daniel's barely audible cue, people pushed closer. Then came the yearlings. A pair of teenage volunteers, kids who had never handled draft horses, were invited to try basic commands. To everyone's shock, the yearlings responded with gentle precision, adjusting to the teens' nervous gestures with patience that bordered on uncanny. By the end of the demonstration, the applause was loud enough to startle Pearl, though only for a second. After that day, demand exploded. Letters came from Missouri, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Colorado, breeding inquiries, purchase offers, training requests. Agricultural journals published articles about the Kennedy Cream Draft Revival. A regional paper even ran the headline, "The Little Farm That Saved a Giant Horse." It felt surreal. Daniel had gone from a struggling, uncertain farmer to the face of a national movement, one built on trust, luck, and the rarest horse he'd ever seen. And through it all, Pearl remained the steady heart of the operation, guiding nervous handlers, teaching young foals, carrying the quiet strength of a breed that refused to disappear. The Kennedy farm wasn't just surviving anymore. It was leading. By the early 1940s, the Kennedy place didn't look anything like the weary farm Daniel had inherited. New fences lined the pastures, fresh paint covered the barn, and everywhere you looked, cream-colored horses grazed under the Kansas sun, mares, stallions, foals, all moving with that same thoughtful, steady grace Pearl had shown on day one. Visitors arrived almost daily now. Some came to buy. Some came to learn. Some came simply to see the miracle everyone talked about. Daniel handled the crowds as best he could, though he still felt more comfortable with horses than humans. Fortunately, the horses did most of the convincing themselves. A nervous farmer from Oklahoma would climb into the corral, hands shaking, only for a yearling to step toward him, lower its head, and wait patiently for the rope. A young boy who'd never touched a draft horse would give a clumsy cue, and the gelding beside him would respond like he'd been trained for months. Every time Daniel watched moments like that unfold, he felt the same quiet awe. These horses weren't just strong. They weren't just rare. They wanted to work with people, and that alone was saving farms across the Midwest. Even agricultural historians began showing up, notebooks in hand, eager to record how America's only native draft breed had clawed its way back from extinction. One evening, as Daniel locked up the barn, he paused to watch the horses spread across the pasture, more than he'd ever imagined owning. Pearl stood at the center, grazing peacefully, Eclipse a few yards away like a silent guardian. Ruth stepped up beside him. "Your father would have been proud of this." Daniel swallowed hard. "I just did what I could." She shook her head gently. "No, son. You believed in something before anyone else did. That's the difference." In the fading light, the herd looked almost golden, and Daniel realized the truth. He hadn't just rebuilt a farm, he'd rebuilt a legacy. Pearl grew older, but her presence never dimmed. Even in her later years, she moved with the same calm confidence that had first captured Daniel's heart at the Topeka auction. Younger mares followed her lead, foals learned by watching her, and handlers, experienced or not, still trusted her more than their own instincts. By then, the Kennedy breeding program had produced dozens of American cream drafts working across the Midwest. Farmers wrote letters thanking Daniel for horses that had saved their operations. County fairs invited him as a guest of honor. The American Cream Draft Horse Association credited his efforts with reviving the entire breed. But none of it felt as significant as the quiet moments. Pearl standing beneath the old cottonwood tree, the foals clustered around her like students at their teacher's feet. When she turned 23, her steps slowed. She spent more time resting in the pasture, watching her descendants with soft amber eyes that still held that same knowing warmth. Daniel understood the day was coming. One gentle spring morning, Pearl lay down in her favorite patch of grass and didn't get back up. Daniel knelt beside her, resting a hand on the mare who had carried him through the hardest years of his life. "Thank you," he whispered, voice breaking, "for everything." They buried her under the cottonwood. Daniel placed a simple stone marker there, a tribute as modest and dignified as the mare herself. Pearl, American Cream, draft 1929-1952. She saved a farm, a family, and a breed. Over the next weeks, Daniel often found himself pausing at the fence line, looking toward the tree where she rested. The fields she'd once plowed were full of her descendants, strong, gentle, intelligent, just like her. Ruth said it best one evening as they watched a young filly trot past with Pearl's unmistakable gait. "She taught you how to be a farmer, Daniel, and she taught those horses how to be creams." Daniel nodded, feeling the truth settle deep in his chest. Pearl wasn't just the start of the breeding program. She was the heart of everything. Years passed, and the Kennedy farm became more than land. It became a landmark, a place people traveled to in order to understand how a nearly lost breed found its second wind. Journalists wrote about it, historians documented it. Breeders traced their bloodlines back to one mare whose calm intelligence had changed everything. Pearl. Even long after her passing, her presence lived on in every field. You could see her gait in the way her grandfoals moved, light, steady, purposeful. You could hear echoes of her patience in the way young creams responded to nervous handlers. Daniel sometimes caught himself scanning the pasture for her cream-colored coat, half expecting to find her watching over the herd. By the time he reached old age, the Kennedy operation had grown to more than 60 horses. American cream drafts were once again working across the country, from small homesteads to agricultural schools training the next generation. And every time someone visited to buy a horse, Daniel would tell them the same story. It all started with a mare nobody wanted. In his 70s, Daniel finally slowed down. He handed more of the work to younger family members who had grown up learning the same lessons Pearl had once taught him. But he never fully retired. Every morning, he walked the pastures with a cane and fed a few treats to the horses who still followed him like he was the only man alive. When the American Cream Draft Horse Association honored him with a Lifetime Achievement Award, their president said words Daniel never forgot. Without Daniel Kennedy, this breed would not exist today. He accepted the recognition with quiet humility, but deep down, he knew who deserved the true credit. Pearl had saved him first. Then, she saved the farm. And in the end, she saved an entire breed from disappearing. On his last spring morning, Daniel sat beneath the cottonwood tree where Pearl rested. Foals grazed nearby, their coats glowing like sunlight on cream. The breeze carried the scent of wheat and wild grass, familiar, comforting, timeless. He closed his eyes, feeling the earth hum beneath him, the same way it had on the day he brought Pearl home. And for the first time in decades, he felt no worry, no burden, only pride and peace, a life's work fulfilled. By the next sunrise, the farm woke without him. But his legacy lived on in every hoofprint pressed into Kansas soil. Because sometimes the biggest miracles begin with the smallest acts of faith. A frightened young farmer, a risky purchase, and a gentle golden mare who changed the future. And so, the story that began in dust and desperation ended in light, with a breed restored, a farm reborn, and a partnership that proved one simple truth. Sometimes the rarest things in the world are exactly what we need to build something extraordinary.